Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for a bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Most of the interviews that we do on The Politics Guys are, well, maybe you'd call them at least slightly wonky. We talk to a lot of political scientists, economists, that sort of thing. Today's interview is different. I'm talking with Sheila Tate, who was the press secretary to First Lady Nancy Reagan from 1981 to 1985. You might say, why would you talk to the press secretary of a first lady who was first lady quite a while ago? Well, there are a couple of reasons I wanted to just briefly get into before we get to the interview. First off is that Ronald Reagan was really the first president that I was sort of politically aware of, I guess you could say, growing up. And I had a deep fascination with Reagan. I was a embarrassingly large Reagan sort of fanboy, if you will. An odd thing to be a fan of maybe a president, but when you're a kid. But I mean, I had coffee mugs. I had all kinds. I read all the books, and I actually had, believe it or not, a Ronald Reagan, let's call it an action figure, okay? So yeah, that's how deep it went. And so I knew a lot about Reagan, or I thought I did. But I always had this sort of caricature view of Nancy Reagan as this sort of evil, cold dragon lady, and who was this, fierce protector of her husband. Now, part of that I think was true, but also I had a sense that Nancy Reagan was a more influential and powerful first lady in many ways than a lot of maybe the first ladies who have come since her. And so when I had the opportunity to talk to Sheila about her experiences with Nancy Reagan, I thought it would be pretty fascinating. And I looked at, I read the book, and I thought it was a very interesting book. It gave me a view of Nancy Reagan that I just simply didn't have before. And so for those reasons, I thought that a talk with Sheila Tate would be a very interesting thing. I certainly enjoyed it, and I hope you do too. Thanks. My guest today is Sheila Tate, who served as press secretary to First Lady Nancy Reagan from 1981 to 1985. After leaving the White House staff, she co-founded the Washington, D.C. public relations firm Powell Tate. She served as press secretary to George H.W. Bush during his successful campaign for the presidency in 1988, as well as for his transition. Sheila remained in close touch with Nancy Reagan after the Reagans returned to California, speaking with her often until Mrs. Reagan's passing in 2016. Ms. Tate is the author of the recently released book, The Lady in Red, An Intimate Portrait of Nancy Reagan. Sheila Tate, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to talking to you and to your listeners.
To start with, I don't think that most people necessarily have a very good sense of what exactly first ladies do. And based on, your time with Nancy Reagan, I think you're certainly in a unique position to give us some insight as to that. So I was wondering if we could start by you talking a little bit about how Nancy Reagan approached the job of first lady.
Well, I mean, the key to understanding what any first lady does is that the job has no job description. And so each one figures it out for herself. So it's, there's not any set pattern for a first lady. But my sense is that a first lady is as influential as her relationship is tied to how close she is to her husband. People will tell you that, maybe Mamie Eisenhower or Bess Truman were just, kind of off in the corner because they didn't have close relations with their spouse. And I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know that Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan were a team, and she had no interest in getting involved in policy discussions on the West Wing of the White House, but she certainly, what she cared about was him, and that he was properly managed, I think is the right word.
I guess in the sense that everyone else around the president, or most everyone else around the president, has some sort, or often many, ulterior or other motives, interests, that sort of thing. But with the first lady, if there is that close relationship, presumably one of her primary motives, or if not the primary motive, is what's best for the president, basically.
That's exactly right.
And so I could see where that would be very valuable.
And I don't think necessarily that. I mean, the staffers who work for the president, for example, had, they had responsibilities and they had huge demands on themselves. Nothing self-serving at all, but there's just a lot of pressure. A lot of pressure to jam the schedule, for instance, And Nancy Reagan we were out of town, and she once showed me his schedule, and she said, "Look at the way they pack this schedule." She said, "Especially when I'm gone." She said, "But he doesn't work well that way. He needs a break between meetings." And so she would get on the phone with Mike Deaver or whoever and say, "You got to reduce this schedule a bit." And then they would send a new one, and it would be definitely more manageable. And I mean, I think that's a good positive contribution to make to the President of the United States.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And some people would say, well, you would hope that a chief of staff would do some of that. But of course, oftentimes presidents and chiefs of staff, they're not necessarily as connected or as close, certainly, as, say, Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan were.
Well, a good one is pretty well connected. I mean, someone like Jim Baker. But there's pressure on him. He's got 50 people that are, banging the door down to see the president, and he has to try to manage that process.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think some people might wonder, well, what exactly does a press secretary for a first lady do? And so I was wondering also if you could talk a little bit about, first off, how you ended up as Mrs. Reagan's press secretary and what that job involved.
Well, sort of like a lot of things in my life, it just sort of happened. I was working at a big PR firm in Washington, and my boss was a friend of the Reagans, and he had gone over to the campaign and been the communications director. And I stayed back in the office to run some business, and he called me one day and said, "I need your resume. There's a job at the White House, and I think you're qualified for it, and I'd like to get you in consideration." So I sent him the resume, and 2 hours later he called me and said, "It's 4 o'clock. By 6 o'clock, I need you at Blair House."
Wow.
And he still hadn't, he said, "I can't tell you what the job is, but I kind of figured it out because there was talk that Nancy Reagan was unhappy with the press secretary she had hired initially, who was from California and was, interested in somebody else. And so I suspected that's what it was. But when I got there, we sat down and talked, and I was a nervous wreck. I mean,
yeah, sure.
I literally remember putting my hands underneath my legs so that you wouldn't see how they were shaking. I mean, that's sort of, it's the first time I'd ever met anybody like that. And so finally settled down, and we talked, and she told me that she really wanted to get involved in youth drug abuse. And at the time, I remember thinking, what a depressing subject. And, not the traditional kind of thing a first lady has done in the past. And so we had a nice conversation, but she never said what the job was. So when I left, I thanked her and went my merry way, and I thought, well, that was interesting, but I don't know what it was all about. So the next day they called and asked me to start meeting with Mike Deaver and a whole bunch of people, ending up with Jim Brady. And Jim Brady said, it's down to 2 people. And I said, no, I didn't know that. And he said, well, I'm voting for you. And I said, well, I want the job. And so 2 hours later, she called and offered me the job. And this was mid-December of 1980, like 10 days before the inauguration. So I went to work. That was on a Friday night. I went to work on Monday morning, but not until the Washington Post got a leak, and the story was all over the papers on Sunday. So that was the beginning of my, and I walked into my transition office, and sitting there waiting for me was Barbara Walters.
Wow, well, there you go. That's a surprise.
That was the beginning, yeah.
So what exactly did the job involve?
Well, I was expected to be with her anywhere that she had an event separate from the president. For instance, if she went with the president to the ranch, I didn't have to go. But if she went, to Phoenix, Arizona with him to visit, she was going to visit her mother, and he had a speech, but she also had a speech. And I had to be there. Anytime she was in public, I had to be there. So I traveled the world with her, basically, and almost every place I can think of in the United States. That's just part of it. The other part, of course, is care and feeding of the press corps. And I had to help the press get to know her, and that probably took a good year of, she was very wary of the press, and we spent a good deal of time making her comfortable, and then having the press start to get a sense of who she was.
I also like to ask you before I forget, actually, about your book. I mean, now you were press secretary for Mrs. Reagan from 81 to 85, but you stayed in touch after until her death. And so, why did you decide to write about your time with Nancy Reagan?
I was approached by several publishers when I first left the White House. I had no interest, and I didn't like the idea. I didn't like people that left a position where they had to have a lot of personal insight and experience with an official, and then run out and write about it. But when I went to her memorial service, I can't tell you how many people came up to me and said that they wished that more people knew the Nancy we knew. And that is so true. I mean, there was still kind of a cardboard cutout vision of her among many people. And I still get people who say, well, what was she really like? That kind of stuff. And so the more I thought about it, the more I thought maybe. It took me another year to say, well, let me give it a try. So that's how it happened. I mean, it's just accident. It was an accidental decision.
Yeah, well, I have memories of the Reagan presidency. I sort of was a kid in the 1980s, and I was sort of precociously following politics. And when I think of Nancy Reagan, the first thing that comes to my mind, it's probably not that unusual, is just say no. And you talk about that campaign in the book, and I'm guessing you would say, would you characterize that as her major sort of issue policy focus?
Yes. Absolutely. And, I mean, her staff kept trying to talk her out of it. We came up with all sorts of other options, and she finally said, if I'm going to do something for 4 years or even 8 years, it's got to be something I care about. I mean, those are her exact words. And it was like, so stop all this alternatives. We're going to do this. Now figure out how we're going to do it. And that really is how it came to be. She led us. We didn't lead her.
Did they think it was sort of too dark for a first lady to do? Yeah,
exactly. I mean, think about, first ladies had been involved in beautification and, kind of ethereal things. And it just, it seemed too heavy. And what was her, I kept thinking, what's her expertise in this issue? Well, she didn't have any, except that her dear friend, Art Linkletter, lost his daughter who had a flashback from taking LSD and jumped off a roof and killed herself. And she told us that story, and I've always stuck with it because she really was adamant about doing this. And she said, nobody, even Art Linkler, nobody had any idea. Nobody knew what to do. And that was what was going on then. People would find out their child was on drugs, and they didn't know what to do. We found out there were all these parent groups that had just come up through the grassroots, people who, gathered together and made themselves intelligent on the issue, educated themselves, and started becoming very active grassroots organized. And they, they still exist. They have a big national conference in Atlanta every year. But it was finding these groups and starting to meet with them and going to the different treatment centers and figuring out, making sure they were all legitimate and, there wasn't any problems. And that took us the better part of a year. And we set out finally. She started raising money for the Straight Inc. and a couple of other very well-known treatment centers. And in New York and all over the place. We went down to see Ross Perot, who started the Texas War on Drugs. And he had parent groups that were very well organized, and she met with them. And then she started meeting with the kids themselves, and the kids really responded well to her. And it was probably 3 years into it, or maybe 4, before they finally developed the Just Say No name for it. It just was, it was what it was. When we hauled press along with us, and they were very skeptical at first, and over time, they really came to recognize her commitment, because we'd be dragging, and she'd still be pulling us along. She really, really cared about the issue, and kids really, really listened to her. And I have in my book a number of statistics from that era, and it shows a significant impact in the age groups she was targeting.
So, there are some people, of course, when they heard the campaign initially, there was sort of a certain amount of eye rolling and that kind of thing. But I take it then that Mrs. Reagan felt that actually that she was making a positive impact, and that's your argument in the book as well.
She really was. It's without question. All you have to do is read the stats on it. And it's too bad that, once a first lady leaves office, she loses a lot of that platform. Nancy Reagan kept working on it. I wish somebody would pick up the mantle now and deal with the opioid crisis.
One other thing that probably the second biggest thing that pops into my mind when I think of Nancy Reagan, aside from the appearance on Different Strokes, which is a whole different story,
right?
But that she was just very, very protective of her husband. And there was this sort of idea that Nancy Reagan was kind of like the dragon lady. Even there were some staffers apparently who felt that she was too tough on them when she felt they weren't acting in the best interests of the president and that sort of thing. Obviously, you spent a lot of time with Nancy Reagan. How much truth to that was there? Is that a mischaracterization of her?
Yeah, mainly. She wasn't shy about being critical of someone if, in fact, she recognized that they were more concerned about their own interests and less about his. And in fact, a lot of people I've talked to, one of the first things they say, former staffers, is that she was an incredibly good. She was incredibly good at determining someone's motives, and she understood character. She saw it, and she saw when people were out for themselves and less interested in the president's agenda, which is a good thing. That is protective. But what's interesting about the whole, I believed I understood exactly why she was as protective of him as she was. And that it stemmed from the fact that she was left with an aunt and uncle when she was 2 years old, because her mother had to go on the road as an actress, and her mother would come back, with some regularity, but she wasn't living with her for 6 years. And that had to have made her terribly insecure. And I thought, that would make her very protective of what she has. And so I was talking to her brother, Dick Davis, a neurosurgeon in Philadelphia. And I told him my theory, and I thought he would agree with me. And he said, that has nothing to do with it. I said, no. He said, I can tell you exactly why she was protective. And I said, well, tell me. And he said, she was exactly mirroring her mother. He said Edie Davis, when she married Dick Davis, the neurosurgeon out in Chicago, she became his protector. And he said if anyone dared say anything even mildly critical of Loyal Davis, the wrath of Edie would descend upon them. And he was laughing about it, but he said that's exactly the way Nancy is. When she thinks someone is attacking her husband, she comes after him. There's a Fred Fielding, who was our White House counsel and a fabulous lawyer. When he wanted to leave the White House after about 4.5 years, she got very upset with him. And he's got a staff memory section that I got him to write for me, and where he talks about it. And he said that when she would call, it was hard on him because he was trying to quit smoking, and when she would call, he'd start smoking again. But he said I felt so bad about leaving based on her being so upset about it. He said, I went home, I came back into work the next day, and Nancy was calling. I thought, oh, it's going to start all over again. And he said she called me to apologize, to say that was really out of line of me to talk that way. She said she had talked to her husband, and he had said, Fred Fielding has stayed longer than anyone else in that capacity. He's got financial issues he really needs to address, and I've appreciated his service. And Nancy said that she was embarrassed that she had yelled at him, apparently. So, and they became friends again.
So I guess the sort of the dragon lady type thing was true, but only in the sense that when she sniffed out opportunists who were trying to take advantage another way of the president, then she would kind of pounce very fiercely, and they obviously were not too crazy about being found out and kind of pushed aside.
And there was also what I noticed, a lot of the West Wing fellas would get very nervous around her. And it was not because that she had ever done anything to deserve it, but that they seemed to understand how much implied power she had based on the fact that she had such a good relationship with her husband.
In the book, you mentioned something, it really caught my attention. You wrote that you thought that Nancy Reagan was a natural diplomat. And I guess I was sort of surprised by that. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you felt or how you saw her as an asset to the president on foreign trips, or, when foreign leaders and dignitaries would come to the White House.
Right. Well, I had the same first reaction because my editor said, I want you to think about writing a chapter of Nancy Reagan and her diplomacy. And I thought, what are you talking about? And then the more I thought about it, and the more I read my old notes and things, she really was. She made so many friends for us during that time, and that's what I mean by diplomacy. For instance, they were in China, and the Chinese leader, he started flirting with her in front of the cameras. And he said to her, one thing, we had done this great, you may remember this, we had done this wonderful campaign where we asked children from across America to send us their pennies, and it was pennies for pandas. The pandas were suffering in China because of lack of bamboo. And so we were buying bamboo and getting it to China. And so he personally, publicly thanked her for what she was doing for the children of China and helping them get bamboo for the pandas. And then he said, I would like to have you come visit China again, but please without your husband this time. and there was there was a great story that she told me about. She was in Germany with, in fact, this was in a newspaper article. Hannelore Schmidt, the German chancellor's wife. They were standing, and there was this huge sprawl of photographers, news photographers, and you have to stand there forever and smile. And she said to her, "How do you keep smiling during all this?" And Nancy Reagan said, "I have a secret. Just start saying the alphabet without moving your lips. And it forces you into a smile."
Wow.
And so the two of them stood there and smiled, and that's the way you make personal friends, you know. And it was that kind of thing that I felt was grounds for saying she really was a great diplomat.
Yeah, that's really interesting to me, because oftentimes the feel or the remembrance I think that some people have of Nancy Reagan is her being sort of cold and distant and imperious and that sort of thing, but that suggests someone who's very different from that.
Totally different. I mean, totally different. She, you should have heard her gushing about Giverny and how she wanted to stay there the rest of her life. It was so beautiful. Monet's home. And, I mean, if she liked you, if she had a wonderful sense of humor. For all of us experienced that, but most Americans didn't. I mean, all the staff knew it. She once told me a story that, and I cannot for the life of me remember who this was or why she was there, but she visited Nancy Reagan up in the residence. They were having tea or something, and Nancy Reagan was wearing a wraparound skirt, and she stood up to say goodbye to her guest, and her skirt fell off.
Oh, geez.
And she said, she looked at the woman and she said, "Well, I guess this is one meeting you'll never forget."
Yeah.
And, you know, she was able to make light of herself. And I wish more people had seen that part of her.
You know, I of course, most listeners, I'm sure, know that not that long after leaving the White House, President Reagan was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and obviously he and Nancy had to find a way to deal with that until the president's death in 2004. And I'm sure this was, devastating, very tough for her, as it is, for all spouses, people with Alzheimer's. But I would think especially for someone who just seems so incredibly devoted to her husband as Nancy Reagan was. And so you obviously had, were in communication with her. How was that for her? How did she cope and get through that difficult time?
She just kept saying, the sad part is that this was supposed to be our golden years, and she said he's losing all the memories. Yeah. And what she did is she just shrunk her world, and she almost never left the house. Robert Taylor was a friend of theirs, and he had long since died, but his widow lived up the street from the Reagans in the home they bought after they returned from the White House. And she used to walk up the street on Saturdays and have lunch with her at her house. And other than occasionally going, if Mike Deaver or somebody came into town and they'd go out to the Bel Air Hotel, I went out there once with her, and have lunch, and that was it. I mean, she didn't want to be away from him. So she just continued to, and I always said, her protectiveness when he was sick, was heralded. But when she was protective at the White House, she was given, she was berated. It's really interesting. But she was the same person. She behaved the same way in both circumstances.
And of course, she survived him by, I think, like 12 years, I believe it.
Yeah,
I believe it was. And so that period without him had to be a very difficult adjustment as well, I would imagine.
She would come back to Washington periodically. I mean, for instance, when the Reagan building was dedicated, and when he was awarded various honorifics. So I think probably, that took a lot of her focus, just thinking about his legacy.
I have one final question for you. What would you say, thinking about Nancy Reagan, that most people, or that people maybe most commonly misunderstand about her or get wrong about her? The biggest misconceptions, I guess, because I got the sense you're talking about writing the book that many people didn't know the real Nancy, the Nancy that you knew and staffers knew. So what are those big misconceptions you were really hoping to correct by this portrait of her?
One of the biggest ones was that she was kind of humorless. Yeah. And nothing could be further from the truth. And all you have to do is read the last chapter of my book, which is the story of a dog named Digby. And this was as she was dying. And she maintained a sense of humor. This is just days before she died. I don't want to give that
right.
away because I really want
spoilers.
people to read that paragraph. To me, that chapter is my favorite chapter in the book. And I put off writing that last chapter for a long time because the idea depressed me. Everybody that I talked to, I said, "What do you miss now that she's gone?" And they said, "Hearing her voice." And that's exactly how I felt. I mean, nothing was more comforting than this call saying, "Sheila," and then she'd talk for half an hour, and I'd be trying to work on client business, and at the time I occasionally thought this was terribly inconvenient, and now I treasure every moment of it. Really, I can't tell you what a great friend she became.
Do you think that part of that is that misconception is that at least I always picture, the picture on the cover of Lady in Red is just really fitting in how I see Nancy Reagan, sort of a almost regal sort of look. Mm-hmm. And that just from a visual just feels kind of maybe distancing to some people, and maybe that didn't kind of let out those elements of her personality.
Well, she was very elegant.
Yeah.
And that picture, that's her official White House portrait. So she picked that. So there I knew that's something that she liked very much. And she was a very pretty woman, and I think she was that a lot of people were sort of put off by her. She was just stunning, and she was reserved. She would never do anything inappropriate in public, but she was a lot of fun in private. She'd put her feet up, and we'd laugh over all kinds of things.
All right. Well, with that, we will close. Sheila Tate, I really enjoyed talking to you, and I should mention it was really something reading Lady in Red, because I came away from the book when I closed it having a very different view of the Nancy Reagan I thought I knew, and so it was a great experience for me, and I really enjoyed talking with you. Thanks for taking the time.
That was my whole purpose.
Well, it worked for me.
The more I hear that, the happier I am.
Well, mission accomplished. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
You bet. Thanks.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Support from listeners just like you is what keeps the show going, and we truly do appreciate it. If you're interested in joining our great group of Politics Guys supporters, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links you'll see there. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or whatever other podcast app you use. Share this episode with your friends and followers, and pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also helps. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you want to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post things throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguyspage. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.